Hey, welcome back to our continuing series through the book of Galatians. My name is Pastor Ben, and we are reading in Galatians 4, verses 1 through 7 today. Just before this, Paul has been talking about a couple of pretty mind-blowing concepts. The idea that we are sons of God through our faith in Christ, and also that we are heirs of the promise to Abraham. And in today's passage, we see him explaining this more and giving just some more depth and understanding to what it really means for our salvation as far as it concerns our relationship to God, our relationship to the law, and our relationship to each other. So let's read from Galatians 4. What I am saying is that as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. He is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and since you are a son, God has made you also an heir. So Paul is reiterating things that he's already brought up in the previous chapter and in some different places. So he opens with, what I am saying is that as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The idea here is that as far as the household is concerned, a child, they are still considered a child, doesn't really have a lot of rights. There's a lot of rules that they would have to follow at home in the same way that a slave doesn't really have a lot of rights underneath the father or the household. And so as children, then, this idea of being subject to guardians and trustees, Paul's already pointed out that the law was sent as a guardian, as a tutor, as a sort of moral nanny to help us and keep us both safe from ourselves, safe from some of the dangers of sin and the world around us, but also, as Paul is pointing out here, to kind of keep us in our place. We also have to understand that this idea of children, from the Roman perspective, would be anything before adulthood. So this modern idea of teenagery was not a thing back then, but the Roman tradition would be that once the father decided that the child was ready, then there would be a special ceremony that child would then be bestowed a new tunic and toga and be given the status of adult. So this idea of being a child is not necessarily just being, a small person, but really anything before the true step into adulthood. And so that's why he says, so also when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. Both the Jews and the Gentiles would understand this idea of the basic principles of the world as sort of the ABCs of approaching life. Again, for the Jews, we know it's the Jewish law as passed down from Moses. For the Gentiles, it may have been some kind of pagan beliefs about the way that the world worked, whether it was karma or just the idea of cause and effect, that the things we do on this world are going to cause things to happen, and we will reap the repercussions of it. But what Paul is trying to encourage the believers is to think beyond this natural law, because we know that God's grace doesn't make sense in sort of that reciprocation thing. We know it's an undeserved gift, and so God doesn't operate on the basic principles of the world. And then he goes on in verse 4 to say, but when the time had fully come, which another way you could say that was at just the right time. This idea that it was a perfect moment in making this change. And that word but is really important. There's a big transition that's happening. And he says then that God sent his Son, born of a woman, which Paul specifically pointing out born of a woman versus just saying born of man or born as a man, just points to the reality of the virgin birth. and also the real physical side of being born of a woman. And then the next phrase, born under law, the Jews would have really appreciated this thought because Jesus would have been born under Jewish law, not just some moral law, not a general idea of government or something like that, but he's speaking directly of the Jewish tradition, the Jewish beliefs. And then in verse 5, he says, to redeem those under the law. So God, or Jesus as God, has the power to redeem us, and Jesus as man has the right to redeem us because he lived the perfect life. He did fulfill the law. And so that's why he's able to redeem us. As it goes on, he redeems those under the law so that we might receive the full rights of sons. It's not just that we're being redeemed out of slavery to the law. We're not just being brought out of that bondage. We're being brought into the family. We're being brought in as adopted children, which gives us status and rights and things that we did not have or deserve while we were slaves to the law. And then he goes on to give some of the benefits of being a child. He says, because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. Which this verse is just a beautiful picture of the Trinity and how God is three persons, but also the essence of God is truly in all three of those things. So God the Father sent God, the Spirit of God, the Son, into our hearts. And the Spirit, Paul describes him as the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. We see this phrase a couple of times. We see it in Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane, where he is crying out and saying, let this cup of your wrath pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. We also see Paul use this phrase in the letter to Romans, in Romans 8. And this idea of Abba, Father, Abba is this Aramaic word for father that has this intimacy inside of it, this knowingness, this child to father relationship, and also this sense of trust, of saying, whether we're crying out, I need help, or look at what I've done, that the response to that is going to be one of love and care. And so being able to cry out, Abba, Father, right? Not just say it, not just whisper it, but to really put it out there that, God, you are my Father, and I need you in this moment for whatever it is. This is an incredible just truth, even for us today, that we are able to cry out to our Father and know that he hears us and know that he cares about us and loves us, and he wants us to cry out to him. And so we finish up this section in verse 7. He says, so you are no longer a slave, but a son. And since you are a son, God has also made you an heir. So becoming a son gives the heir to the promise that God made to Abraham, as talked about in the last few sections. And this idea of coming into the inheritance, we know that for us is our eternal reward in heaven, and being able to live and worship and praise and be in the presence of God, which is just an incredible thought, that we should inherit eternity with God instead of the eternity that we deserve from our sin. And so again, Paul is trying to get the Galatian believers to get out of their heads about the worldly transactions through the law, and instead give them a more heavenly mindset. And that's an important thought for us today as well, that we don't get so wrapped up in the doing and in trying to do good, trying to be good. Not that we shouldn't do good. We know that God's prepared good works for us in advance. Not that we shouldn't be good. God's called us to live a holy life. But when those things are the way that we measure our relationship with God, we've missed the idea that God has adopted us in. He's already accepted us. He's already forgiven us if we have believed on Jesus. And so being able to interact with God with an intimacy, with a familial relationship rather than a transactional one, as the Jews were trying to push on the Gentiles, and then sometimes we push on to ourselves or push on to others. That good things are good, but when those become the goal, we've really missed out. And so my prayer as you consider what it means to be a child of God, what it means to be given an heir, being taken out of the slavery to the law, that how the choices that we make and the things that we face, how we can use those to better our relationship with God rather than just to interact with him or try to please him in some way that like the prodigal son trying to come back and saying, I've messed up and make me a slave so at least I can be with you again. And instead the father goes, no, you're my son. I'm so happy that you have returned. And recognizing that that's the way that God sees us. So my prayer is that you will meditate and be able to just rest in the wonder of the love of the Father for you.